He moved toward her with that slow, poisonous confidence men like him carried, a confidence built on unchecked authority, swollen ego, and the belief that no one would dare stop him. 280, two soldiers stood frozen in the courtyard, their rifles slung, their training abandoned, their discipline shattered by the spectacle unfolding in front of them. And she, one woman, one lieutenant, did not step back. The air tasted of dust and sun, baked metal. A hot breeze rolled through the base, carrying the faint smell of gun oil, desert sand, and the tension of men who suddenly realized they might witness something irreversible. The courtyard had gone so quiet that the flutter of a loose flag sounded like a warning whisper. No one had ever raised a hand to her. Not here, not anywhere, and yet the captain kept advancing, jaw tight, eyes burning with a private fury he thought he had the right to unleash publicly. His boots struck the ground with an ugly finality, an unspoken promise that something violent was about to happen. The soldiers didn't know what sparked it. Some had heard the rumors how she reported him for falsifying readiness reports, how she refused to cover the mistakes he buried, how he despised that someone younger, sharper, and more principled than him had threatened the fragile world of lies he built around his rank. But rumors didn't matter. What mattered was the moment, and the moment felt like a blade suspended in the air. She kept her hands behind her back, fingers interlocked, chin steady. Her silence was sharp enough to cut him. There was no fear in her face, only an almost sorrowful stillness, as if she were mourning something unseen. Perhaps she was. Perhaps she was mourning the version of him who could have chosen restraint. Then he moved. Not a shove, not a grab, a strike. He swung toward her with the full weight of a man convinced he was untouchable. Every soldier flinched, some gasped. One sergeant whispered a prayer under his breath, expecting to hear the sickening impact of knuckles against skin. But she was already gone. Her body shifted with a calmness that felt inhuman, as if her instincts operated in a deeper, quieter dimension than everyone else's. She stepped aside, letting his fist carve only empty air. The sound of it slicing past her was soft, almost embarrassed. And in that sliver of time, barely long enough for a heartbeat, her expression changed from stillness to something colder. Not anger, resolve. Before he could regain balance, before he understood he had missed, before the crowd inhaled again, she seized his wrist. A single precise motion, delivered with the restraint of someone trained to end violence swiftly, but not cruelly. A crack split the silence. It was not loud, but it was absolute. A clean, decisive fracture that carried more truth than any court report or reprimand could. His arm collapsed inward, useless, folded like something no longer belonging to him. His mouth opened in a silent scream that never quite formed, the shock swallowing his breath before pain could force sound out. The courtyard shifted not in chaos, but in stunned, reverent disbelief. She did not gloat. She did not speak. She simply released him, allowing him to crumple to the ground as gently as a man with a shattered limb could fall. Her eyes lowered, not in victory but in disappointment. The soldiers watched her, not him, because something in the air had changed, an unspoken question rising among them. What kind of courage does a person hold to stand alone against both injustice and authority? Her hands returned behind her back, posture calm, as if she had merely brushed dust off her uniform. But beneath the composed exterior, a storm churned, memories of warnings ignored, boundaries crossed, and the quiet hope that the man now on his knees would never force this final lesson. She hadn't wanted to break him, but he had given her no choice, and now, as medics rushed and whispers rippled outward, the base would never be the same. For a long moment no one moved. The courtyard remained suspended in a state of disbelief, as if time itself was hesitating to resume. Dust swirled lazily through the sunlight, settling on the stunned soldiers who stood like statues, men and women trained for war, yet unprepared for the moral earthquake that had unfolded before their eyes. She didn't look at the captain curled on the ground, clutching his shattered arm in a dazed, trembling grip. Instead, her gaze drifted across the sea of uniforms, each pair of eyes searching hers for direction, explanation, or reassurance. She offered none. Her silence held its own command, firmer than any shouted order. Inside her chest, her heartbeat finally slowed, dropping from the sharp crescendo of instinct into a steady, relentless rhythm. She had not broken his arm out of rage. She would have despised herself for that. The motion had come from training, necessity, and a grim understanding that sometimes the only way to stop a man intent on violence is to make sure he cannot try again. Across the courtyard, an old warrant officer, one who had served long enough to see pride ruin better men, felt a strange ache of recognition. This will divide the base, he thought, not because she was wronged, but because she was right. Two corporals knelt beside the broken captain, but they seemed unsure whether to comfort him or keep distance. His authority, so carefully constructed, had shattered alongside his bone. He tried to speak, but the words snagged in his throat, drowned by an awareness he could not yet face. Every man and woman around him had just seen who he really was. A shadow passed over him. The lieutenant had shifted slightly, not toward him, but away, as if granting him the dignity of not staring at his weakness. Yet the distance felt symbolic, the final severing of a connection he had mistaken for his domain to control. But the story did not end with a broken arm, not for her. Her thoughts drifted back to the weeks leading up to this moment, the quiet warnings she'd given him, the subtle tension in briefings when he tried to belittle her contributions, the way he dismissed protocol, believing himself immune to scrutiny. She remembered the night she submitted the report documenting his misconduct, how long she had sat with the cursor blinking, knowing it would ignite a conflict she never wanted. Every principle she valued had been placed on one side of a scale. Every consequence she feared weighed the other. Integrity had tipped the balance. Now, as she stood before nearly 300 witnesses, she felt none of the vindication others might have expected. Instead, she felt a weight settling onto her shoulders, not guilt, but responsibility for herself, for the truth, and for the dozens of younger soldiers who watched her with a mixture of awe and trembling relief. The base commander arrived then, striding through the perimeter gate with a pace that betrayed both urgency and disbelief. His eyes swept over the scene, the captain on the ground, the soldiers frozen in shock, the lieutenant standing alone like a quiet storm that had already passed. He approached her first, not the injured man. Her stillness did not falter even as she felt his gaze weighing everything, her posture, her restraint, the unspoken fear that perhaps he would blame her. But the commander had seen enough human conflict in his service to recognize when violence was chosen and when it was forced. He stopped at arm's length, studying her face. Her eyes were calm, but beneath them lived a hurt that no injury could match, the hurt of being pushed until she had no choice but to defend not just herself, but her honor. Behind them, the soldiers whispered, some admired her, some feared what this would mean for the chain of command. All understood one truth: she had not acted in anger, she had acted in protection. The commander exhaled slowly, not with frustration, but with the gravity of a man realizing the entire base had just crossed an invisible line. This incident would echo far beyond the courtyard. Reports would be filed, investigations launched. Careers weighed against truth, but even before he spoke, everyone knew this story wasn't about a broken arm. It was about everything that had led to it, and everything that would follow. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long, stretched shadows across the courtyard, shadows that felt like silent witnesses, recording every breath, every tremor, every shifting piece of a story that refused to quietly fade. The medics finally lifted the captain onto a stretcher, though he didn't fight them. Shock had subdued him, hollowing out the arrogance that once filled his posture. His eyes, once sharp with entitlement, now looked lost, swirling with the confusion of a man who had collided, violently, with the consequences he thought he'd outrun. But the lieutenant did not watch him leave. Her gaze had settled on the ground for a moment, as if studying the cracked earth beneath her boots, grounding herself in the reality she could not change. The murmurs among the soldiers grew like distant thunder, nervous, uncertain, electrified. Somewhere within the silence, a private thought formed in more than one mind. If she hadn't stopped him, who would have? The commander asked her to walk with him, not as an order, but as an unspoken request for truth. She followed him toward the administrative building, each step echoing through a corridor of eyes that parted for her, not out of fear, but respect touched with awe. Even those who had rarely noticed her before now seemed to see something they hadn't, the quiet strength of someone who acted not to win, but to protect. Inside the commander's office, the air was cooler, the blinds filtering the desert light into narrow stripes that fell across the floor like measured sentences. He didn't sit, and neither did she. The weight of what happened didn't belong in chairs. It belonged in the empty space between them, where honesty had no room to hide. He asked her to recount everything. She did clearly, calmly, without embellishment. He spoke of the threats veiled behind professional language, the unwanted proximity during briefings, the pressured attempts to rewrite reports, the dismissal of safety concerns, and the slow escalation that led to the courtyard confrontation. She did not justify what she did. She simply described why there had been no other choice. The commander listened without interruption. His face remained stern, not at her, but at the realization that this had grown under his command without him seeing it. His silence formed an invisible apology, one he couldn't voice yet, not until the full truth came to light. When she finished, the room felt heavier, as if the truth had mass. He nodded once, slow and decisive. "You didn't fail." His expression seemed to say, "But I did." She bowed her head slightly, a gesture not of shame, but of acceptance. The truth often carried a sting even when it was righteous. They stepped outside a few minutes later, met instantly by rows of soldiers still scattered across the courtyard. None had been dismissed. None had returned to their duties. The event had sunk too deep, threading itself into their sense of justice, loyalty, and the unspoken rules that governed life in uniform. As she appeared again, whispers swept through the ranks like wind through tall grass. Some straightened their posture unconsciously. Others lowered their heads, not in judgment, but in quiet reflection of what they had witnessed. A few young recruits watched her with a dawning realization of the kind of courage their manuals never described. But there were doubts, too, lingering in the minds of those who feared what tomorrow would bring. Would she be punished? Would the captain twist the story? Would the institution side with rank over truth, as it had too many times in history? The lieutenant felt their eyes, their questions, their unspoken hopes. She didn't offer comfort, but she offered presence. She remained composed, even though a storm of fatigue, adrenaline, and sorrow pressed at the edges of her calm. The wounded captain was gone now, but his shadow still lingered across the courtyard. What happened next would shape not only his future and hers, but the moral backbone of the entire base. That evening, as dusk softened the harsh heat of the day, she walked toward the barracks, the sky painted in streaks of gold and deepening blue. She moved with purpose, though inside her chest lived the quiet tremor of someone who had braced for impact and survived. She knew the investigation would begin by sunrise. She knew some would fight for truth, and some would fight to protect the illusion of perfect leadership. But she also knew something else, something that pulsed through the base like an awakening. When courage stands alone, others learn to stand with it. And for the first time since the confrontation, she felt a small, steady warmth rise within her. Not pride, but hope. A hope that what happened today might break not only a man's arm, but a cycle. Night settled over the base with a quiet that felt almost ceremonial, as if the darkness itself had arrived to judge what daylight had revealed. The courtyard, once alive with tension and disbelief, now lay still, its silence holding the memory of every heartbeat that had paused, every breath that had caught. The desert wind softened, brushing over the empty bleachers and metal railings with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the day's violence. She sat alone on the edge of her bunk, the dim barracks lights flickering slightly, casting thin shadows across her uniform. The fabric still held the sun's warmth, and beneath it, her skin tingled with the aftershock of adrenaline slowly ebbing away. Her hands, steady during the confrontation, now trembled faintly human, vulnerable, no longer fueled by instinct or duty. She stared at them for a long moment, recognizing the weight of what they had done, and more importantly, the weight of why. Across the room, a few soldiers whispered among themselves, cautious, uncertain, but not hostile. Their glances toward her carried something deeper than curiosity, something close to reverence, as if they were witnessing the quiet aftermath of an act that had shifted the moral gravity of their world. Nobody approached her. They seemed to understand that solitude was not isolation for her, but a form of recovery. Outside, the base lights cast long, ghost-like beams across the ground as the commander made his way toward the barracks. His steps were measured, deliberate, carrying the gravity of a man who had spent hours wrestling with paperwork, testimony, and the uncomfortable truth that leadership sometimes means admitting what went unseen. He paused at the door before entering, not from hesitation, but from respect. He found her sitting with the same calm posture she had held in the courtyard, though the weariness in her eyes revealed a depth of exhaustion that combat training never described. When he spoke, his voice held neither pity nor reprimand, only the weight of responsibility and the acknowledgement of a truth he could no longer ignore. He told her the investigation was launched, that multiple soldiers had already come forward, not just to recount what happened in the courtyard, but to detail a pattern of behavior long ignored: intimidation, favoritism, falsified records, quiet acts of control disguised as leadership. Her report had opened a floodgate she couldn't have predicted. For the first time that day, her composure cracked, not in fear, but in relief so profound it felt like a fragile breath she'd been holding for months finally escaped. She hadn't broken him, his actions had broken the illusion he tried to hide behind, and her courage had simply exposed it. The commander told her something else too, something she didn't expect. Earlier, after she left his office, he had walked the courtyard alone, and in the dust, still visible, were the footprints of nearly 300 soldiers who had stood frozen, witnessing a line they were never meant to see crossed. Those prints, he said, were a testament to why her actions mattered, not because she defeated a man, but because she refused to let injustice stand unchallenged. When he finished speaking, she lifted her gaze to meet his. In his eyes, she saw no anger, no disappointment, only a quiet gratitude. A leader recognizing another. As he left, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the first cool breath of night. She stepped outside, drawn toward the open space of the courtyard. The ground felt different now, lighter, almost cleansed. She walked across it slowly, her boots pressing into the dust, leaving their own imprint beside the countless ones left earlier. Above her, the sky stretched endlessly, a canvas of stars emerging like distant lanterns. She breathed deeply for the first time all day, the air crisp and soothing. Her body ached, not from combat, but from the emotional weight of standing alone against something far larger than one man's anger. Behind her, unseen but very real, soldiers began to gather, not in formation, not by command, but by instinct. A few stepped out into the courtyard, drawn by something they couldn't name. They didn't speak to her. They didn't have to. Their presence was its own declaration. You were right, and you weren't alone after all. One of the youngest recruits, barely old enough to hide the tremor in his hands, watched her with eyes filled not with fear of authority, but with a new understanding of courage. The kind that doesn't shout, the kind that doesn't seek glory, the kind that stands quietly, firmly, even when the world shakes. She looked around at the gathering silhouettes, soldiers who had witnessed violence, but more importantly, integrity. Her heart softened. Today had not been about breaking a man. It had been about breaking a silence that had lived here far too long. And in that silent courtyard, with the desert night folding around her and the whispers of new beginnings carried on the breeze, she finally allowed herself to feel the truth. Sometimes a single act of courage doesn't just defend a person, it defends everyone who watches. And the base, forever changed, would remember her not for the moment she shattered his arm, but for the moment she refused to shatter her own principles.